Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am back for my LCK Week 7 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings video for the week. It was a very interesting, a very fun week in LCK this week, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. There are definitely some series I'm excited to talk about, some that went according to plan, and some that most certainly did not go according to plan. So, let's go ahead and jump right into it. I don't want to waste too much time, but first, let me know down in the comment section below what series you were most looking forward to this week in all of Week 7 of LCK. There were a lot to choose from, a lot of really interesting ones, so I'm kind of interested to see what you guys were most looking forward to, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into our Day 1 recap here in Week 7. We kicked off Day 1 with a classic matchup here between T1 and KT Rolster. Of course, the telecom wars aren't quite as alive and strong as they were maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but at the same time, it's definitely still a rivalry that I am excited to keep up with, and T1 is able to take this one 2-1. It was relatively close. I definitely think KT actually played pretty well in this series, especially compared to what T1 was doing for a lot of it, but unfortunately T1 is able to pull out the win here for all the KT fans. Couple players on T1 I think playing really, really well at the moment. Not only the entire roster, I've talked about like Zeus and Owner and Carry all playing well, but I think the two stars of this series have to be Faker and Guma. Both of them playing really, really well. Gumayushi's going to get my player of the series pretty obviously. Here he was really, really good in Game 1 during their win on the Sivir. Maybe not the most important player or anything like that, because Zeus had a really good game, but most specifically Faker and Keria both had really, really great games on more supportive champions in the Galio and the Yuumi in Game 1, but still something to keep in mind. And then Game 3, the penultimate game in this series, really, if it wasn't for that Zeri Yuumi pick, I really don't think T1 wins this series. And so Gumayushi very, very important on that Zeri in Game 3. Kind of the reason they were actually able to win the game. So Guma is going to get my player of the series here. He was very, very good. Keria, like I said, was also really good. That Zeri-Yuumi combo is really disgusting. Yuumi in general right now just feels very, very overtuned, no matter who you put her with, but most especially with Zeri, it becomes pretty much unbeatable, as we saw in Game 2 and Game 3 here for KT and T1. So a very strong lane, and Keria and Guma played it pretty much perfectly. Like I said, Faker had a really phenomenal Game 1 here on the Galio, and he was pretty good in Game 3 as well on the Orianna. A much more passive role here for Faker on this team, which he's kind of adopted all year long. It's definitely been an interesting transition to see him go to more of these super passive picks. We've been seeing a lot of Taliyah out of him. We've been seeing the Galio, seeing some Orianna here. Definitely not building for damage, and I think it's definitely intriguing to see that just in general, because obviously Faker being T1, like being Faker, being the greatest of all time, it's very interesting to see him take probably the most supportive role of anybody on the roster not named Keria. Owner with the Nocturne pick in Game 3 I thought was really huge. This is a pick I have been talking about in multiple other videos as being really, really strong right now in certain circumstances. I think Twitch generally is a super underutilized pick, but I understand the fear of picking Twitch because a pick like Nocturne can really, really hinder what Twitch wants to do. Not only can that Nocturne get on Twitch really easily if you don't have everybody just sitting there waiting to peel, it can be a problem, but also just turning out the lights for someone like Twitch who wants to be super far away from the action and out of range can make it very difficult for him to actually be able to do damage, especially if he's already casted his ult in a team fight. So very much see the benefit there, and it really worked out for them in Game 3. But as for KT Rolster, they definitely had opportunities in this series to win it. Game 2 was really, really strong from them. They had a game plan and they executed on it. Cuz was really determined to get aiming in life really far ahead and just have the Zeri Yuumi be able to end the game. And they were able to do that. Aiming was pretty strong in that one on the Zeri and was just kind of able to do enough damage in team fights to eventually scale up and end the game. Even if they didn't have a ton of damage outside of Zeri, this is a very low damage comp with Sion, Skarner, Ryze as your top side. Like, it's a very low damage comp, but luckily Zeri does enough damage for everyone, so pretty lucky there. And then moving on to Game 3, they were really proactive, and they actually played the early game really, really well here. They did quite a good job of being able to get both Rascal and Vikla a little bit of gold, and kind of put them on the board a bit, but unfortunately you were just eventually going to get outscaled by an Ornn, Zeri, Yuumi team. You were just never really going to be able to contest them in team fights, especially if your Twitch wasn't able to actually do damage in team fights, where you were relying on him a lot with this comp that you built. So definitely something to keep in mind there. I thought KT played really well. Unfortunately, I just thought their draft kind of let them down here in Game 3. Outlook-wise, I certainly don't think that this is a bad showing for KT Rolster. They actually had another showing later in the week, which we will get to, of course, but they've honestly been impressing me a lot in recent weeks. Mostly because I feel like, as opposed to a team maybe like Liiv SANDBOX, and not to call out SANDBOX, but they genuinely feel like they can win from multiple parts of the map, rather than just focusing on one lane and hoping that that lane wins because the rest of it just isn't strong. It really feels like if aiming gets shut down, like, completely, you can still win on picks, on Rascal. Like, Rascal can get ahead. And Vikla, honestly, has been a pleasant surprise here for KT Rolster. I think their roster as a whole just feels more complete, and I think that's really, really great to see. I didn't mention, Life is going to be my dud of the series here. I didn't think he played particularly well in Game 1 here on the Lulu. And then in Game 3 on the Lulu, he just had no impact on the game. Like I said, aiming was essentially taken out of the game, and Life was still spending a lot of time, waiting to get aiming online. And obviously I get it comp-wise, but at the end of the day, you have to understand that he's not going to be that important in those team fights because of that Nocturne ult. So maybe you need to adjust your strategy just a tad bit. But yeah, Life is unfortunately going to get my dud of the series. But outlook-wise, I still think everybody on KT is interesting, and for them to put up such a strong fight against a team like T1 is definitely good. As for T1, they continue to roll along. They are arguably the best team in the LCK. Obviously, them and Gen.G are going to be fighting over that all week long. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting group of talent that they have here. This very well could be one of the best T1 teams that has ever existed, SKT. We're going to have to see what they do, later in the season, playoffs and stuff. But right now, they're just, like, so good. Moving on to our second series here of Day 1. We had a fun matchup here between DAMWON KIA and Hanwha Life Esports. DAMWON is able to pick up the 2-1 series win after dropping Game 1. Luckily for them, they were actually able to pull it out here. They were in all 3 games. I will say they really should have won Game 1. Unfortunately, they kind of throw it away towards the later half of that game just due to some really good front-to-back team fighting here from Hanwha. Mostly Dudu in that top lane, really being the only one to actually be able to do a lot in that series. And in that game in particular, he was genuinely phenomenal. And he would have some rough ones later in the series here on Shyvana and Gangplank, but that Gwen game in Game 1 was genuinely fantastic from him. Probably the only reason Hanwha Life actually has any wins this season, honestly, from my experience, really feels to be Dudu in the top lane. So you can say what you want about his ability to be capitalized on, maybe play a little bit too over-aggressive, etc., but he really, like, when he is on, he's kind of been the reason that this Hanwha Life team wins games. So, and then games 2 and 3 were a lot more in DAMWON's favor. My player of the series here, I think, is a little up for debate, but for me, it's going to go to Nuguri in the top lane, who I thought was actually really good in this series. He wasn't super flashy because he was on tanks in both games, but I actually thought his game 2 here on Sion was really phenomenal. His ultimates late game were really opening a lot up for Showmaker, for Canyon, for Dectum to really do a lot of damage in these fights. And then really oppressive and really difficult to actually play into if you play it well. Not only in lane, which obviously it was for the Gangplank, but also generally just out of lane as well. It was very much an issue to teamfight into here. On Fleek really had no lanes here with the Sejuani, you have the Galio, you have the Zeri Yuumi. You really have no lanes as a Lee Sin to really be able to actually capitalize on, so he doesn't have much of a game plan, and Nuguri is just able to kind of just tank everything that they want to do and be a really good frontliner. So honestly, for me, player of the series here is going to go to Nuguri in the top lane, but honestly, big shout out to Canyon, big shout out to Showmaker, Dectum, Callan. All of them played really well in this series, but mostly Canyon. I actually thought had a really good game 3 here. He was opening a lot up on the map, did a really good job of getting that bot lane ahead. And obviously, Zeri Yuumi, we've talked about it a lot on this channel. I haven't really said my specific thoughts on the lane. It's obviously giga broken. It's very strong as a duo. I don't think Zeri is the problem in this lane. I will be quite honest with you. It very much feels like Yuumi is just a problem in the meta, generally speaking. I think it is much stronger if you pair it with Zeri, but you pair Yuumi with pretty much any hyper carry, anybody who can just kind of take over a team fight here, and I think that that carry is going to be significantly stronger and put in a position where it is very easy for them to win. So, I don't know. I'm just kind of in that position where I'm anti-Yuumi. I would be banning Yuumi every game if I had the opportunity to, or I'd be picking it, because obviously I do think it is very strong. But Canyon obviously recognized that as well, doing a very good job in Game 3, and in Game 2 of that, for that matter, being able to get that bottom lane ahead. Showmaker doing a good job on the Galio to make sure that they're protected as well. Honestly, just draft-wise, I thought DAMWON was pretty good here. But yeah, DAMWON playing relatively fine overall. As for Hanwha Life, like I said, Dudu did a really good job in Game 1 of basically dragging this team across the finish line and winning the game for them. But Games 2 and 3 were just not even close. Like, Game 2 was a blowout, and Game 3, I think you could argue, was even more of a blowout. Maybe a little bit slower, but obviously not a single kill for Hanwha Life in that game. It's got to feel really bad when you pick Draven and you go 0-0-0. And that's what SamD did in this series. He did not play a particularly good series overall, but honestly, nobody here on Hanwha Life did. I think it's a pretty easy dud of the series for me, and it is going to go to Karis in the mid lane. I think you could realistically give this to Vista as well, but for me, like, Karis was clearly the worst player in the series here. He goes for the Rise in Game 2, which again is a pick that I think you have to be really good on right now in order to make work. Obviously, I've talked up people like UCal over in the LPL playing it, but it's weak. Like, it's generally a weak pick, so you have to be really good at that pick to make it work. Karis got obliterated in Game 2 on it, and then in Game 3, first pick Azir here on blue side, and you get counterpicked with the Galio. I mean, if you want to call it a counterpick, I think Galio does rather well into Azir. And the Azir does absolutely nothing all game. 0-4 and 0. Can't do anything. Like, if you're going to spend that much draft capital on Karis, he really has to perform, and he absolutely did not here. So he's going to get my dud of the series. But like I said, you could give it to Vista. You could realistically give it to SamD because he didn't do anything all series long on a very aggressive pick. Like 2 games of Draven, and he gets one. He goes 1-2-1 across 2 games. Get 0-0-0. I have to remind you, 0-0-0 in Game 3 on Draven. It's about as bad as it gets. And then on Fleek, again, just got completely out jungled. Like, Lee Sin in Game 3 was just a disaster when the rest of your team was going to be losing. There's really no lane to actually punish. So, definitely not great here. Outlook-wise, Hanwha Life still continues to be one of the worst teams in the league. Even the game that they won here, they absolutely probably shouldn't have won. It really was DK's game to lose, and unfortunately they lost it. So, shout out to Dudu for carrying them to every single win they've gotten this year, but this was not going to be a series win for them. As for DAMWON, they looked pretty good here. I think top to bottom, even though they lost a game here, I think generally speaking, they looked pretty strong against Hanwha Life, and I really don't think that much less of them for losing that game just because of how they looked in it. I think generally moving on, they're still a top 3 team. I do think there is still that separation between T1, Gen.G, and then them, but at the end of the day, like, all they have to do is put themselves in a position to capitalize in playoffs. If they can get there, I definitely think they have the talent to make it work. It's just about pulling through with it. Moving on to Day 2 now here, and Day 2 action was kicked off with one of those aforementioned upsets that I was talking about in the intro to this video. Of course, I am talking about the series between Liiv SANDBOX and Nongshim RedForce, as Nongshim, against all odds, is actually able to pick up a series win here against SANDBOX, beating them 2-1. I do not think a lot of people were seeing this coming at all. I certainly wasn't, but honestly, like, it doesn't shock me too much, because again, I've been talking a little bit about the things I'm worried about Liiv SANDBOX, and a lot of them came true in this series. So, let's talk about Nongshim first, because congratulations, they won a series. They won Game 1, they won Game 3, and both games they did deserve to win. It's not like they just kind of got, you know, to late game and they scaled a little bit better and blah, 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 blah. Like, they played well in this series. I want to give a big shout out to Dread, who is going to get my player of the series here for Nongshim. He was really, really good in this series. Not only was he important in their win in Game 1 here, creating a lot on the map as that Wukong, but in Game 3, he was essential to this win on the Skarner. That Skarner Yuumi with the Sivir ultimate can be very difficult to actively stop, and he did a really good job of just creating plays on that pick. I expect to see a lot more Skarner as this meta evolves, because obviously we're in this meta where Sivir, I think a lot of people see as a pretty strong pick, and obviously Yuumi is pretty great And generally speaking, Skarner does really well with both of those picks. I expect to see a lot more of the Crystal Scorpion as we continue moving onward in this patch. But just generally speaking, I thought Dread did a fantastic job on that pick of being able to create a lot. The other member of Nongshim that I think is probably not going to get as much credit for how well he did in this series is going to be Kana in the top lane, who actively abused Dove. Dove was not so great in this one, but Kana did a great job of generally just abusing him and being better than him pretty much the entire series here. You could talk about the Gnar in Game 1. Hell, you could even talk about the Gnar in Game 2. The Ornn was a little bit safer for Dove, and I thought he did a lot better on that, but you move into these picks like Gwen and Gnar for Dove, and honestly, Kana did a really good job of taking advantage of that. Game 3 was brutal in the top lane here. A very good game for the Gangplank here, and just generally exactly what you want to see if you're looking for a top side victory, which you got in this Nongshim game. Obviously, you're looking for Azir to scale. You're looking for Sivir to bounce off of those, to bounce those W's and for the Q to do 8 million damage here. So, it ended up working out that the rest of the team got strong anyways, and you also had a strong top side, but that was almost a plus for this team. BDD playing really well here. I thought he outplayed Closer pretty significantly, and this really starts to accent a lot of the fears I had for Liiv SANDBOX, in the fact that I think their top side, their top, Dove and Closer, their solo laners can just kind of get abused if they're not getting, if Prince isn't super far ahead to just win team fights for them. Closer and Dove can be a problem for this Liiv SANDBOX team, and we definitely saw that in this series against Nongshim, but overall, I want to give a shout out to Ghost and Snowflower, because they actually played really well here. This is the first, I think, full series of Snowflower that we've gotten all season long, and he actually looked really good here. I'm not going to say that he looked perfect, because at the end of the day, he got a lot of really good breaks going his way. He got Sivir Yuumi in Game 3, which is a pretty huge dub, I think, generally speaking. Ghost looked really good as well, but it'll be interesting to see if they can build off of this, Nongshim as a team, and hopefully kind of get some confidence and not be Nongshim that we've known them all season long. As for SANDBOX, this is exactly what I was worried about, right? Dove and Closer just being too heavy to carry sometimes against teams that are good in solo lanes, have good players. It's definitely something to be concerned about, because if Prince, it really does feel like if Prince doesn't get Giga fed on, in these games, because he did in Game 2, he was really strong in Game 2 here, the one game that they won, they were able to get him ahead on the Aphelios into a weak Xayah Rakan lane here. They were able to kind of punish that. Nobody on Nongshim was really able to, completely destroy them. And so, Prince was able to get online, he was able to win the game, but games 1 and 2, he just wasn't able to do that. And so, they lost. That is really, cut and dry what Liiv SANDBOX has, right? Either Prince wins them the game, or they lose the game. It really is no in between. They have no one else on this team that can actively win them League of Legends games. Even if I do like Krako as a player, I just don't think he's that kind of mentality player. He's not the one who's going to go out and win you games by himself. So it's definitely concerning, and this loss is definitely concerning overall. Dove is, of course, going to get my dud of the series here. He was quite bad in the series, just generally speaking, but especially in the penultimate Game 3, just getting abused by Kana, I think, over and over again. I think you can make a real argument that he was genuinely a problem for that team. But outside of that, I think if I don't want to sit here and just say that it's all up to Prince, I also think there is some merit in saying that this team just has not adapted to the new meta very well. It doesn't seem like Prince is all that good on Sivir, and Sivir being such a power pick in the meta right now, I think is super important. Obviously, you need to prioritize the Yuumi a bunch more. You got it in Game 1 here, and you weren't able to win on it, which is not good, but Yuumi's area is obviously something that we're seeing a lot prioritized across the league, and even Yuumi Sivir, these are the lanes that you have to be good at the moment, and it just doesn't seem like Liiv SANDBOX has that. Closer also played a pretty horrendously bad game here on the Seraphine in Game 3. I do not expect to see them go back to that. So, overall, outlook-wise, Liiv definitely goes down a few notches for me here. Definitely a concerning loss, not just because it's too Nongshim, but it pretty much confirms a lot of the fears that I had been talking about with Liiv SANDBOX come the end of the season, that if teams really decide, hey, Prince isn't going to beat us in this game, that Liiv just has a much more difficult time actively winning games. So, definitely concerning there. It'll be kind of a blueprint, I think, for a lot of other teams come the rest of the year. And then for Nongshim, they've got to be so relieved. This feels like their first win in, 5 or 6 weeks, and that's got to feel phenomenal. They have to be sitting on cloud 9 right now. We'll see if they can carry that momentum into the rest of the week and the rest of the season. Obviously, I'm not sure it's really going to matter. They're pretty much out of playoffs as it is already, but, obviously going into next year, it'll be good to see if a lot of these players can get their confidence back. You know, Kana, BDD, Dread, Ghost, like a lot of the players that I think were pretty highly looked upon going into the season. If they can kind of get a little bit of their mojo back and, you know, maybe not just get blackballed out of the league next year, that would probably be good for them. So it'll definitely be hopeful to see if they can continue on this this good stretch of winning. Moving on here to our second series here of day 2 action. And we had a fun one here between Gen.G and DRX. Gen.G picking up the 2-0 series win here, just kind of being Gen.G. I've talked about it so much on this channel at this point that it really feels like I just reiterate myself every single week. But, like, if this team is on, like, if this team is playing at its best, I don't know if there's a single team in the world that is more talented than Gen.G, and I don't even think it's that close, if I'm being honest. I think it's really, like, them and top esports in terms of, like, talent level, and maybe T1, like, is kind of in there, but, like, those are the only two teams I really think are on that level of, like, okay, well, if they're feeling it today, they just simply cannot lose the game. And that's where I'm at with Gen.G, where if they're feeling it, I don't think there's a team in the world that takes games off of them, let alone a series. And we saw that here against DRX. They were just phenomenal. Like, everybody on this team was genuinely phenomenal. Chovy's going to get my player of the series here because he was disgusting on 2 games of Ahri here, just obliterating not only Zika in the mid lane, but making Pioshik's life a living hell across the map, going bot lane and killing Beryl over and over again. Like, this Ahri was very disgusting to watch play. Chovy continues to be amazing. We've not talked about him like a lot in the last few weeks, and that, you know, Gen.G's been on a huge win streak, and that should tell you everything that you need to know, that, like, even when Chovy takes a back seat, like, he's arguably the best player in the LCK, period, full stop, and even when he takes a back seat for, like, 2 weeks in a row, this team still is arguably the best team in the LCK. Like, it is really unbelievable. He comes back out here and he dominates DRX, absolutely obliterates them here. It's very, very fun to watch. And then you've got Doran, I thought, who also had a really great series here. What a great Sejuani game in Game 1. That's how you take over the game on Sejuani. We talked about it with Nuguri earlier in the week of it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to look like a superstar on Sejuani, right? But he had a really, 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 really good time here. Not only just beating up Kingen in the top lane, but having a huge impact in these late game team fights. Not that they were ever really in doubt with how much gold Gen.G had going into them, but just something to keep in mind. Ruler looks really good here. He actually gets Kalista in Game 2, which feels like, you know, a blessing. I feel like this has been a Kalista meta all year long, and nobody has really allowed Ruler to actually have that champion, obviously his signature champion. And he finally gets it here, and he destroys Deft. He's just the better player on it. Gen.G are just better from top to bottom. Peanut and Lehens weren't bad by any means. They were, in fact, really, really good. I just don't have time to talk about them because everybody on this team genuinely is phenomenal. As for DRX, it's definitely a rough loss here. I kind of called this last week. I remember, you know, I was talking about how, like, oh, wow, DRX just had a phenomenal week. They do really well against, you know, they beat up on DAMWON, and they were looking really, really good. But this is how DRX goes. Like, they're going to go 2-0 last week, and now this week they're going to go 0-2. Like, that's just how it happens, and lo and behold, we get the DRX that I expected to showing up. This is just what happens, is they go in these stretches of having being really, really strong and being, looking like they're unbeatable, and then coming back down to earth against better teams and just not really having that fight in them. Matchup-wise, I don't think they draft all that well. I hate the Zilean here in Game 1. I hate the Lee Sin even more here in Game 2. I think Lee Sin is just one of those picks where, again, I've talked about this. You know, Lee Sin's a good champion, but if you don't win by 10 minutes, like, if you're not super far ahead in gold by 10 minutes, the game is actually over for you. And that is just too much of a risk to take against a team like Gen.G. I just don't see the reason to even try that kind of strategy. Unfortunately, they went for it and they failed heavily. I think DRX has pretty consistently been the worst drafting team in the LCK, and I think that continued here. Beryl was really awful, like really giga awful in this series. Not only was he awful in Game 1 here on the Zilean, but he was abused, like genuinely abused in Game 2 here on the Lulu. He had 9 or 10 deaths, like he was close to 10 deaths in that game. Genuinely awful. Beryl's gonna get my dud of the series here. He has, like, low-key been very bad for DRX so far over the course of summer. Like, I've given a lot of credit to Deft, and I think I've given a lot of credit to Zika, and even Kingen, relatively, for stepping up and being okay in this split so far. But, like, Beryl and Pyosik have actively been problems for DRX. Barrel, I think, maybe more undercover. I think everybody knows that Pyosik is pretty hit or miss for this DRX team. I still think they are better with him, as they proved last week, but Barrel has kind of secretly been, like, very bad for DRX so far this year, and so hopefully he can turn that around. He's kind of been arguably their worst player over the course of this split, but it's not like anybody else on this team did much better. Like I said, Zico was kind of abused by Chovy in lane, and then Chovy was able to do whatever he wanted. Pyosik had a really bad series here. Just, again, the Lee Sin game is nothing, and he got obliterated in game 1 on the Wukong, and then Kingin was also just not good, not as good as Doran. He got Flame Horizoned in game 1 on when going into a Sejuani. So, or maybe it wasn't game 1, maybe it was game 2. I'm trying to remember. Was it the Gangplank game? I'm pretty sure it was the Gangplank game that he Flame Horizoned Kingin. So, I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it was game 2 here. Just generally speaking, DRX getting outclassed at every level. Outlook-wise, honestly, this really doesn't change a lot for either team for me. Like I said, I was going into this week expecting this outcome to happen, so I really am not surprised by it in any way, shape, or form. DRX continues to be this team that I truly do believe can beat almost anybody on their good days, but on their bad days, they don't even put up a fight because the draft is just so genuinely bad, so don't really love that. And then Gen.G, like I said earlier, I mean, they beat anybody in the world when they're on. Like, when they are genuinely on, they're the best team in the world, in my opinion. Obviously, they've got a very big series later this week against T1. We will definitely be looking forward to talking about that one, but for now, this is pretty much exactly what you want to see. This team has only dropped 3 games, not series, games, all split long. So yeah, they've been ridiculously dominant, and honestly, it's been very, very fun to watch. Moving on to day 3 action here in week 7 of the LCK. We had a fun series kicking off day 3, that is for sure, as we had a matchup here between Fredit BRION and the Kwangdong Freecs. KTF pulling out the 2-1 series win, but I mean, really, they were very close to not doing that. This was probably a series that should have been over 2-0 after game 1, and really through most of game 2. But KTF is able to pull out the comeback here in game 2, and they are able to pull out the win here in game 3 as well. So, props to KTF, but honestly, like, come on, bro. Like, they very much had this series in the palm of their hands, and they just threw it away. They couldn't do anything with it. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about what KTF did right. I'm going to say a sentence here, and I'm pretty sure I feel confident about it, but I might get some blowback in the comment section for this. KTF plays very similarly to how I view LNG in the LPL, where it's very much like this team has so much promise and potential and talent, but just something isn't clicking. Like, LM isn't good. Their jungler's just not playing up to status. The jungle and mid have no synergy, and that is true. Top lane, while they can carry games, can also just throw games away. And thank God they have their bot laner. Like, very similarly to how I was talking about Light in the LPL recap yesterday, where I'm like, thank God LNG have Light, because they would be nothing without him. KTF would genuinely be nothing without Teddy. And Teddy has really been, like, the focal point and the guy for KTF all year long. And he proved why in this series. Not only was everybody running it for the most part of game 2, and then you just get Teddy to take over the game here on the Jinx and carry you to the win, but he did it again in game 3. Like, he did it twice here in game 2 and game 3. I really don't know where this team would be without Teddy, because nobody else on this team is actively playing well. So it's very, very insane. Keen, I actually thought, had a relatively good start to the year, and ever since like week 4, week 5, he has been like tragically bad. So I don't really know what to tell you there. I don't know if he just checked out like completely, but shout out to Teddy, because without him, like, this team would be in no man's land. He's very clearly going to be my player of the series here for KDF. He continues to be the focal point every single time this team wins games. So big shout out to Teddy. Hoyt, I think, is playing a lot better now that he's come back in. I still don't know if he's better than Moham, because Hoyt was really, really bad for most of spring, but you know, he's come back in here and he's definitely been better than he was in spring. So that's certainly something, even if Keen, Elam, and Fate aren't necessarily playing great. I thought Fate actually had a pretty good game 3 here, but Keen and Elam continue to just kind of be meh. I think Elam's score lines look pretty good this series, but he didn't actually play all that well. And then Keen just kind of got bodied in the top lane here by Morgan, quite frankly. Morgan was the better top laner, which is definitely not something that you want to hear. As for Fredit BRION, Really, they still look good, relatively speaking. I think comparatively to like a lot of the rest of the teams who just like they consistently at least take one game, and I think that's fine. Like they looked so awful at the beginning of the year that I think their recent form has actually been relatively okay. Morgan continues to somehow be this team's best player by like a considerable margin. He was really good in game one. Like he hyper carried this team in game one on the Gnar to their win, and he was a big reason why this team should have won in game two here on the Gwen, but unfortunately just no dice, and then, the whole team lost in game three, so not really much to talk about there. My dud of the series, though, it was a little bit of a toss-up here between Umti and Lava, and Delight was in that conversation as well, but really this was between Umti and Lava for me. I am going to give it to Umti. Again, more Lee Sin picks, more things that I'm just like, oh, you got ahead on Lee Sin and then everybody outscaled you because you don't exist as a champion in the late game. Good to know. Like, I just don't understand why teams are still picking this champion. This is almost worse than Rise, in my opinion, of, like, if you have to be, like, the best player in the world at this champion to feel like it's even worth it at this point. Because after 10 minutes, Lee Sin just does not exist in the game. Like, unless he's, like, super, super fed. But if he's super fed, if he's the one on your team that's super fed, like, you're never going to win a team fight. So, it just feels, it just feels like a waste of a pick, if I'm being completely honest. And we saw that in game two here, where just got completely outscaled, even if he did do well early. And then Lava also played, I thought, these late game fights really, really poorly. His game one on Galio was actually pretty good, but his game two, he just didn't do, he wasn't the Galio that they needed in those late game team fights to keep his team alive, and then game three, he just got abused, not only by Fate, but by Elm as well. So, generally speaking, I just thought Bro played the second half of the series a lot worse, but, it is what it is, right? Like, I'm not going to sit here and say, like, how dare they lose this series, because at the end of the day, they're the worst team, and they proved that they were the worst team, and Teddy was easily the best player in the series by, like, a considerable amount, even if Morgan did do well, so I can't sit here and say that Bro, like, deserves to win this, because they were the ones who threw, rather than, KDF just playing really well on a comeback, so overall, outlook-wise, Fredit BRION continues to be bad. I'm not exactly sure they're the worst team in the LCK. Like, them, Hanwha Life, Nongshim, like, they're all just kind of fighting it out for that 10th spot. I do think they've officially been eliminated for playoffs and by extension Worlds with this series, but, not that they ever had goals of that anyways. Maybe after spring, but definitely with how they've started in summer. Obviously, they're 1-12. They didn't have expectations of being in that conversation anyways, so I don't think that's going to come as a shock to a lot of their fans. But, whatever. Like, this team is building for next year. It is what it is at this point. As for KDF, thank God they have Teddy. Like, again, like, I'm going to say it over and over again. Thank God they have Teddy. Teddy is the one keeping their season alive. I really don't even think they have a shot at playoffs, because the difference between them and, like, KT Rolster or Liiv SANDBOX or even DRX is, like, so huge, in my opinion, right now, that I just think the top six is so solidified in my mind that KDF is probably just going to be one of those teams that just misses out. But if they can continue to maybe put some string some wins together, they're not that far below 500. Like, they could maybe go on some sort of miracle run towards the back half of the season. I think that is very much not likely. It's possible, it's just not likely. I would more so expect this team to just kind of fade into 7th place and just kind of disappoint again and be a lot lower than a lot of people thought they were going to be going into the season. Moving on to our second series here of day 3. We had a fun one. Definitely a fun one. Another little bit of an upset here, as we had DAMWON KIA taking on KT Rolster. And KT with a 2-0 win? Was it clean? No. Maybe not enough to get excited. But still, unbelievable win here from KT Rolster. They're going to be super happy with 2 straight wins over DAMWON. That is not something I expected. I don't think that is something that a lot of people expected here for KT, but they certainly did it, and they did it well. So shout out to them. Let's go over and talk about what they did. In game 1, it was really, really a close game up until a certain point where it was just like, oh, like we have Gwen and Zeri, and now we can just like win team fights. And they did a really good job of getting to that point. Obviously, DAMWON did a good job of getting a lead early. I think their comp is definitely built to end quickly. Not only because of the Lucian Nami, but I think that also benefits Lissandra relatively as well. I think you hit a point in the game where, like, she's just going to, like, damage is going to be too high for her mitigation to actually mean a ton, so. And then, obviously, Lucian and Nami get hard outscaled by pretty much everybody, especially Zeri, so. Definitely something to keep in mind there, and I think you got to that point where Rascal was actually just able to take over a lot of those team fights on the Gwen. And then in game 2, it was actually a little bit of a similar story, but KT was able to get quite a bit of a lead in the early game. Took them a lot longer to close out than I personally would have wanted. Obviously, they had a much later game comp. Again, you're going into that Lucian Nami. You're going into a Trundle, another pick that I think is relatively dangerous early game. But Showmaker did a relatively good job to keep the game in check here on the rise. Not only was he picking people off when he could, when he had the opportunity, but he was doing a pretty good job of keeping waves from being a problem and just keeping the map state in a good situation for DAMWON. But at the end of the day, they just could never team fight into this KT team. Ornn was too massive. Cuz was doing way too much damage to getting those resets here on the Viego. Honestly, just a great series overall from KT. My player of the series here, I am going to give it to Rascal. First of all, I want to give him a big shout out. Only the 3rd top laner in LCK history to reach 1,000 kills behind, I believe, Smeb and Keen. So big shout out to Rascal there. He definitely deserves it. He's someone who I think has been, I've talked about it on this channel quite a bit, underrated for a very long time now. I think he's often lumped in as like, oh, he's just, a good top laner on a team full of superstars, or at least that's how he's been in the past few years. I think he is very much a player that can be a driving force of a team that wants to actively make worlds, and I think we're seeing that here on KT. I'm not saying he's the only driving force, because Aiming is, of course, having a very good season, but I think it would be criminal to underrate what Rascal brings to this team and what he's able to do. He had a great game 1 here on the Gwen, was able to do really well in lane and translate that into some great team fighting. And then in game 2, he was just unkillable on that Ornn. Even with Trundle ultimate on him pretty much every fight, he was still unkillable. Those Ornn ultimates were on point. He had a very solid series here just in general. And then you have Cuz in the jungle, who I've been very critical of, I think, for a majority of this year. Rightfully so, in my opinion. He's definitely been up and down for a lot of this year and been kind of a hindrance for this team's playoff and Worlds dreams, especially in spring. But he had a really good series here. He honestly was, I don't want to say he was better than Canyon for most of it, because I thought Canyon actually played a pretty solid game here in game 1. Unfortunately, they just got outscaled, but game 2, he was your player of the game. No question. Cuz was able to take over those late game team fights here on the Viego and do a really good job of actively putting the nail in the coffin of DAMWON. And that's really impressive as someone, this isn't some, not good DAMWON team, right? DAMWON is a team that I think me and a lot of people expect to have a world spot pretty much locked. Maybe not on that same tier of Gen.G and T1, right? But as pretty clearly the 3rd best team in the LCK. And for KT and Cuz specifically to be able to outplay them so well, I think is a very good sign. Aiming continues to have the best split of his career, pretty much bar none, in my opinion. A really good bounce back series here from him. And then Vikla, I think, is a very big surprise. This is a guy who, game 2 here on the Ahri, he was basically playing frontline Ahri for the majority of this series here. He was playing so aggressive, playing to get kills and playing to stop the enemy team, and he never was really punished for it because his positioning and his mechanics are actively very good. He is, I'm willing to say at this point, definitely an upgrade to what Arya was giving you. Whether you like Arya or not, what Vikla gives this team mechanically and just aggressively, I think has been a huge benefit to their playstyle and has really helped them unlock a lot of the parts of the map. So overall, I think KT's doing really well. As for DAMWON, this is a tough loss to take. They were in both games, they had an opportunity, especially in game 1, where they really felt like they should have been winning this game. But again, this comes back to the idea of I really do not like drafting lack of scaling in this current meta, because I just think it is really dangerous and you're relying a lot on those plays that can really go 50-50 at the beginning of the game. And while DAMWON even got a lot of those plays to work in game 1, especially bot lane here for Dekdom and Kellen, getting them ahead, and Canyon had quite a bit of gold as well, they just hit this point in the game where Gwen was too strong and Zeri was too strong and the Skarner could kind of negate a lot of what they were doing. And they didn't have an answer to any of that in their draft. So definitely don't like these early game focused drafts in this specific meta. I just don't think they work particularly well. But it wasn't all draft problems. I actually think, they played relatively poorly as well. I'm going to give dud of the series here to Nuguri in the top lane. He had 2 games of tank play, and I'm not going to blame him entirely here for this, but it was really easy for Gwen to get on the backline here in game 1 towards the end of this game. And I blame Nuguri a little bit for not being able to peel for his Lucian at any point in this game. Not to say it was only his responsibility. In fact, the entire team is relatively built around peeling for this Lucian, but just something to keep in mind. And then in game 2, he just got brutalized here on the Sejuani. Was easily the worst player in that game. I think you can make a case for Kellen, but really for me, Nuguri was just not very good in this series, especially when they needed him the most. So he's going to get my dud of the series. But like I said, Canyon got gapped here in game 2, even if he did relatively have a game 1. And then DAMWON and Kellen, 2 games of Lucian Nami. Even if they did get ahead in game 1, they lost in game 2, and that's just pretty much unacceptable into Aphelios Lulu. I will give them a shout out. Showmaker, I thought, played game 2 really well and was like the reason that this game took so long for KT to close out, because I thought Showmaker was playing the back half of this really, really well on the Rise. But at the end of the day, he was the only one even doing anything, and Rise just isn't one of those picks that can carry the game for you. So outlook-wise for these two teams, DAMWON continues to look shaky. Like, they're not bad, but they're just not dominant in the way that you would want them to be. I'm not exactly sure what this does for my outlook, like power rankings-wise on them. It's definitely going to be an interesting week for me to have to power rank all these teams, but this is a gigantic win for KT. They're going to be very, very excited to get this. I'm not sure this skyrockets them into top 3 territory or anything, but they're certainly overperforming what I think a lot of people had their expectations at, mostly because of how well Rascal and Aiming really just are playing right now. If they can keep this up for the rest of the season, honestly, this is a team that I think you can make a really good case is a maybe not favorite, but it definitely has a lot of Worlds expectations, and I think that would be amazing for this KT Rolster roster. Moving on here to day 4, and kicking off day 4 action here in the LCK was a matchup here between DRX and Liiv SANDBOX. Liiv SANDBOX is going to take the 2-1 series win here, although I'm not entirely sold on this being like a super solid Liiv win, more than it is like, man, DRX really just has some problems every once in a while. But let's talk about what Liiv did right. Again, they were allowed to play their style. And I think that is really, like, I don't want to be a broken record when it comes to SANDBOX, but it really genuinely feels like when a team allows them to just dump everything into Prince, they're just going to win. And when a team doesn't allow them to do that, they're just going to lose. And DRX just didn't try to stop that game plan at all in this series. Not only is Prince, like, given everything he wants in draft, he's given Zeri in game 1. Kog'Maw in game 2 can really take over into that Zeri matchup, especially with a Rakan. Like, I find that a very difficult lane to actually deal, like, with, like, Lulu Kog actually being very difficult to deal with, even though they lost. Even though they lost, I think Lulu Kog, generally speaking, in that lane can actually cause some problems. And then game 3, you're just giving Sivir into Leona, or into Vayne, of all things. Not Leona, into Vayne, of all things. And I don't get it. Like, I'm not sitting here saying ban out 5 ADCs, because again, ADCs are pretty, like, open on this meta, right? There's a lot of different ADCs that I think are relatively good, but when you're in that game, just, if you're Pioshik, like, just sit bot. Like, literally make it a 3v2 bot and force Closer and force Dove to beat you. Because Closer's not going to beat you. He's just not good enough to beat you. And Dove is certainly not good enough to beat you, especially if he's going to be on Sejuani duty. So, I don't really know why teams aren't doing this, but DRX didn't do that. Prince was able to get online in both game 1 and game 3, and he was able to win the game for them, both games here on the Zeri and then on the Sivir. By the way, he looked a ton better on Sivir in this series than he did earlier in the week. I was saying how I was a little bit worried about how this Liiv SANDBOX team was going to adapt to this new meta, if Sivir was going to be a problem, and that was washed away here in game 3. Prince had a phenomenal game on Sivir. But again, it was in the vein of a very, very good Sivir matchup, just generally speaking. So, I don't really know. Prince is going to get my player of the series. Obviously, he carried both of their wins for them. But again, it's just frustrating to watch as an analyst because it just feels so predictable for Liiv SANDBOX. And yet, these teams do nothing to try and stop that thing that everybody knows they're going to try to do. So, definitely worth keeping in mind. I do want to give a shout out to Closer. Closer played well, but he was really a secondary carry here. Like, he played well in the sense of, like, especially in that game 3, he had some good games here, but it wasn't, like, particularly difficult for him to have good games, right? It was 1v1 for him in lane for a lot of the time, right? And fortunately, you know, like, he had power points across the map. Everybody was doing, like, Prince was so strong by that point that Closer was just kind of feeding off of that. I'm not saying that Closer's a bad player. I just think sometimes Closer's contributions to this Liiv SANDBOX team get significantly overhyped. Again, he also gets his picks here. He gets Ahri, and when he's on these melee champions, very similar to a player like Cream in the LPL, he just looks like a completely different player than he does on something like an Azir. where he just is kind of feeding off of the rest of the team. So, I don't know. Liiv SANDBOX wins here. Prince looks phenomenal, and Prince is mechanically arguably the best ADC in the region. I definitely think you can make that argument, but again, Liiv SANDBOX as a team just feeds so much into him that eventually teams are going to learn that if you take away Prince, you take away a lot of what Liiv SANDBOX wants to do. As for DRX, like, this is just a disappointing week overall. I predicted it, so I'm not sitting here being, like, ridiculously shocked. I told everybody last week I expected them to go 0-2 this week, but just the manner in which they did it, I think, is frustrating. There were certainly parts of this series that they should have won. Deft was actually playing really well. He had a good game pretty much every game, not only on the Lucian in game 1. You know, obviously it wasn't going to translate because Lucian, you picked Lee Sin, Lucian, Nami. Like, I don't know how you expect that draft to ever win late game. Of course it lost. And then in game 2, I actually thought he played really well. It was a big reason why they were able to win that game there. Kingen also played well on the Zeri. Or on the Gwen, I should say. I don't want to take away from Kingen, who actually had a pretty good series here. And then in game 3, he was holding down the fort. He was on wave clear duty as Vayne, who I can't even begin to tell you how ridiculous that is. But even outside of that, he was still doing a lot of damage, was still keeping them in the game. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough because everybody else on the team was kind of running it at that point. So, definitely frustrating to watch as DRX fan. Pioshik, Zika, and Beryl were all bad this series. There's really no other way to put it. I actually thought Pioshik had moments where he was good, but dude, Lee Sin in game 1, like, I've talked about this pick is nothing. And I get it, like, Lee Sin, Lucian, Nami, but it's one of those things where with that trio, if the game is not, like, over, and I don't mean, like, if you're not winning, I mean if the game is not over by 10 to 15 minutes, like, you cannot win. It is genuinely unwinnable. You have no damage late game, especially into Azir, Zeri, Wukong, Sejuani. Like, they are just going to out-team fight you into oblivion. I just don't understand why teams do this. It just feels so brainless to me. But talking about the rest of the teams, like Zika had a really bad series here, just outplayed by Closer at pretty much every avenue. He's kind of been a constant for DRX, but he was certainly not in this one. And then Beryl continues to have his worst split of his career, I think by a considerable margin. I was talking earlier in the week about how Beryl has kind of under the radar been awful for DRX, and I think that continued here. He's going to get my dud of the series. He was taken advantage of by Prince over and over again, not only towards the back half of the series on, like, the Nautilus, but even in the games they were winning here on the Rakan, he wasn't particularly impactful, and then the Nami game in game 1 wasn't great either. So outlook-wise, I really don't like what DRX is doing. I'm very scared. They're the worst drafting team in the LCK by a considerable margin, and they're also ridiculously coin-flippy in terms of their playstyle as well. So I'm really starting to get concerned for DRX. They're back down to 500 here. They're under 500 in game score, but they're 500 in series score, which they're going to be, you know, at least some sort of consolation prize there. But it's definitely worrying because this team just doesn't seem to have it together. And if they don't, like, they're going to have to go on a really hot run in the regional gauntlet in order for them to make Worlds. As for Liiv SANDBOX, I mean, they're everything that I've been saying they are. Like, they are who we thought they were. Like, at this point, I am really solidified that if Prince wins and if Prince gets ahead, Liiv SANDBOX wins. If Prince loses and Prince doesn't get ahead, they lose. There is no in between for them. And that is a strategy that I think good teams, theoretically, should be able to take advantage of. So I'm just hoping to see teams actually do it. Not that I'm voting against Liiv SANDBOX. On the contrary, I talked about this in a comment in a previous video here of, like, Liv is the most fun team to watch in the LCK. Like, SANDBOX is a lot of fun. They're very entertaining, and I really want them to succeed. I don't see a world in which a good team should be, like, should allow them to do exactly what they want to do with no repercussions. And, you know, hopefully good teams figure that out, because just as an analyst, it can be really frustrating to sit here and see it and just somehow the rest of these teams just don't even try. Like, it's not even that they're failing when they're attempting, it's that they're not even trying, and it's just frustrating to watch. So, you know, Liv is a good team right now, but I imagine that they're going to get targeted eventually, and that those weaknesses will come to light. Moving on to the second series here of day 4, and it's the one everybody has been waiting for. The one everybody has been waiting for me to talk about, the top of the table clash here between T1 and Gen.G. And Gen.G picking up the 2-0 win. A pretty dominant 2-0 win, I should add, as well. Wow. This was insane to watch. Really, it was incredible how well Gen.G actually played this series. There are a couple of draft faux pas that I think both teams kind of committed here, but like for the most part, I actually think really this was just Gen.G being better. Like this wasn't like, oh, you know, one team put themselves in a better spot or whatever, right? Like I certainly think that Gen.G was just the better team here. So let's talk about it. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is I've really been like harping on the Lucian Nami lane a lot generally. And it's not because I think that that lane is bad. It's because I think that investing into that lane fully with no late game scaling is bad. But in situations like this, where you have Lucian Nami, you have the Sylas, you have the Akali, like these are things that can really cause problems late game and give Lucian a lot more of an opportunity. It's not a Lee Sin in the jungle, right? You have a lot more options in that late game. I like it significantly more. It's not Lucian Nami that I think is weak. It's the idea of, okay, well, we're just going to stomp the early game that I think is weak. And I don't think Gen.G had that idea going into this draft, and that's where I think, you know, this ended up working out, right? Ruler obviously gets super far ahead here on the Lucian. Not only does he not win early game, by the way, he just does really well in the late game. And I will say at least part of this is, you know, Lucian Nami isn't a strong late game bot lane. It's just Ruler and Lehens being better than everybody else. Like that really is part of it. I want to stress that, at least from my analysis point of Ruler. Like not everybody's going to be able to play Ruler or play Lucian Nami like this. Like this is kind of a different thing for Ruler and Lehens, but at the end of the day, like Ruler played phenomenally here on the Lucian in game 1, and then he gets the Zeri in game 2 and just completely destroys the game. Like it just is genuinely not even close. Ruler's so clearly the player of the series here, and he, in my opinion, is pretty clearly the front runner for MVP of the LCK so far this year. He has been genuinely phenomenal for this Gen.G team. He has been the best player in the LCK by a large margin, and he continues that here by obliterating T1 and just looking like a dominant player. I want to give a big shout out here to Lehens, who continues to have genuinely phenomenal synergy with Ruler. These two have unlocked probably the best versions of each other that have ever played in the LCK, and it's really, really been fun to watch. Lehens here on the Nami in game 1 was doing a lot to help out Ruler, but that Lulu game 2 was a joy to watch. He was just everywhere, keeping everyone safe, making everyone proactive, especially Ruler, but also Chovy, right? Like, this was just a really, really good game from Lehens in game 2 on the Lulu. And Chovy had a really, really under-the-radar great series here. That Ahri game in game 2 was disgusting to watch. He was really proactive on the map, pretty much being everywhere he needed to be, and was just really, really dominant doing so. Everybody on Gen.G playing really well in this series, and it's really, really awesome to see. As for T1, like, this is a rough loss. Like, this kind of does prove the idea that everybody had been having, which is like, oh, Gen.G's just kind of on a different level right now. Like, we had always been given T1 that benefit of the doubt because they beat him last time in the T1 buff, right? Like, T1 always plays better against these better teams. But, like, on paper, Gen.G has just been smashing everybody, and they actually do it here. They smash T1, and it really wasn't even that close. Bot lane was not close. Ruler was significantly better than Gumayusi in this series, and it really wasn't even that particularly close. Lehens was better than Keria, and Keria is someone who I've planted my flag in the, in the sand saying, like, Keria is the best support in the world, and Lehens was just better than him in this series. Not saying that one-to-one it's that simple of a comparison, but it's something to keep your mind on, right? And then Zeus. Like, Zeus has arguably been the best player for T1 so far this year, and he just got obliterated. Like, he was just taken advantage of in this series. Not only did he have a Gwen game in game 1 that just was not good, where he, just had no impact on the game, but Ornn had a very similar problem in game 2 where it was just like, yeah, I guess I'll frontline. Oh, never mind. I'm dead. Like, I have no impact on this game. I'm a tank that can't survive. So, very much not a good series for him. He's going to get my dud of the series here. His first, I think, of his career. This might actually be the worst series that he has had as a pro on T1 here. It was very much not close. So, Zeus just kind of got obliterated here. But overall, I don't think anybody on T1 played particularly well here. Even if game 1 was kind of close, off of the back of Owner having a little bit of gold here on the Nocturne and just being able to make some plays around the map. I think outside of that, nobody on T1 actually played well. And that's really, really frustrating to see, especially if you're kind of on that camp of T1 has the best chance of, like, winning at Worlds or whatever, right? I'm not on that camp anymore, not at all, but, definitely something to keep in mind. Outlook-wise for these two teams, these are the two best teams in the region. Say what you want about Gen.G obliterating them, but don't forget that T1 was the better team last time these two played. I'm going to be really excited to see these two in playoffs. I'm not sure it's quite as cut and dry as this series would make you think of like, oh, Gen.G's just better. I think on their best day, I don't think Gen.G is beatable. I've said that over and over again, and they were on one of their best days here today, which is why they just obliterated T1. But they're not always going to be on their best day. So I'm excited to see these two face off inevitably in playoffs, hopefully in finals. That's kind of what everybody wants to see, right? But, you know, these two teams should be fighting it off to see who the #1 seed for LCK is going to Worlds. Right now, I'm definitely leaning towards Gen.G, though, just because of how unbelievable this series was. And generally speaking, Gen.G has looked more dominant over the course of the season. They can win from every lane, etc., etc. I've said it over and over again how I feel about Gen.G. So, yeah, I mean, they are still the best two teams in the region, but Gen.G just definitely looks to be that cut above. Moving on to our 5th and final day of LCK Week 7 action here. We kicked off our final day with a matchup between Hanwha Liiv Esports and the Kwangdong Freecs, and KTF picking up the 2-1 series win. They go 2-0 this week. They've got to be excited about that. Moving to 6-8, kind of putting themselves in a relatively okay position here if everybody else keeps fumbling the bag at least a little bit. But overall, a pretty decent series here from KTF. They looked really dominant in their wins, even though their Game 1 loss was pretty bad. They looked really, really good in their wins, I'll say, generally speaking, and that was fun to see. Overall, I think it was just a good series from Kwangdong, who continues to kind of push forward and be kind of okay, right? There was a little bit of a toss-up on who my player of the series here. I ended up giving it to Fate. I thought Fate was pretty good in this one. He's someone who I've been a little bit critical of this year because I definitely think he's taken a little bit of a step back so far in 2022. But he had a pretty good one here. He had a really fun game on Rise in Game 2, but really, he gets player of the game, or player of the series, I should say here, for his Lissandra game in Game 3, where he was really able to take over the map. Like, this is what you want to see out of Lissandra. You want to see the ability to just kind of shut down the enemy team, and that's pretty much exactly what happened. Obviously, we'll talk about it. Hanwha committed the draft faux pas of Lee Sin Lucian Nami, saying, okay, if the game goes longer than 15 minutes, we're done. And they didn't even win early game. I mean, Lucian got some kills, but it really didn't matter, right? Like, you know, Fate was ahead, Keen was super ahead on the Gwen, and the game was pretty much just over at that point, generally speaking. So, definitely not good from Hanwha Liiv, but KDF, you know, did their part. Fate was really, really good. Keen had two really good wins, although he was, like, giga bad in their loss in Game 1 here on the Gnar. He was very much not good, but I think you can make a case that he was just as important as Fate was in Game 2 and 3. Where they won. So, you know, the solo laner's kind of stepping up here for KDF, and they've definitely been two big question marks, especially recently for this team. Teddy not really given a lot of resources. He played a fine series. Him and Hoyt, I thought, both played a relatively fine series, but they were kind of the secondary pieces of this team. They were definitely not focused on. I don't necessarily agree with that decision for Kwangdong, but at the same time, you know, it is what it is. If you're not going to put... They have not been willing to put a lot of resources into Teddy at all this year, generally. But I think the big weakness for KDF still comes in the fact? Why did I say that like it did? Still comes in the fact of Elim being a little bit of a problem for this team. He has pretty consistently proven to be one of the worst junglers in the league, and he's going into the only jungler that I have thought has been worse than him this year in On Fleek. And even in Game 1, like, he was just completely out-jungled in Game 1 by On Fleek. And then Game 2, obviously, he beat him up. In Game 3, it was fine. He wasn't great in Game 3, but he was fine. Just generally still not a great showing from Elim. You definitely want to see him get, I don't want to say it, but get replaced at some point, because he was probably the second worst jungler, the second best jungler in the series behind Willer, who he only played one game and he wasn't even that good. But, you know, I still trust Willer more than I trust Elim, and that should show you where I'm at with Elim at this point. But moving on to Hanwha, like I said, the Game 3 draft was completely inexcusable. You can't draft Lee Sin Lucian Nami, you just can't. You're not going to win. You make a couple substitutions here for Game 3. You rock with On Fleek and Samdi for the first couple of games. You go to Willer and Cheani. I would just rather see Willer and Cheani both for the rest of the year. I really don't see any reason to play On Fleek and Samdi at all. On Fleek has been the worst jungler in the LCK by a considerably large margin all year long, and he continued that here. He got absolutely obliterated in Game 2. He's going to be my dud of the series. And then Samdi has also been the worst AD carry in the region by a considerable margin. Well, I guess I can't say that because Henna's been really bad. But, you know, he has been playing like somebody who should be the worst AD carry in the region for a considerable amount of the year. Not that Cheani has been like a considerable amount better, but at least he's not Samdi. Like, at least he's got some level of upside, right? I would just go with the young guns at this point and just rock with that for the rest of the year. But I guess what do I know? Nobody else on this team played quite great. Dudu had a good game 1, but he got clapped in game 3 on that Jax. Just a really, really bad game from him on the Jax in game 3. Karis is nothing for this team. Vista is nothing for this team. They just don't have a lot of avenues to actually win the game, in my opinion. And that really comes out, like, in series like this, where it's just like, oh, okay, like, jungle lost, you have, like, a super early game comp with just Jax as your late game hope, and Jax got obliterated, like, okay, I guess you just lose. Hanwha just doesn't have a lot of actual good players on their team, and it's very much becoming apparent. Outlook-wise for these two teams, Hanwha's arguably the worst team in the league. They will continue to be the worst team in the league for the rest of the year. That's why I say, like, just go with Willer and Cheonny. At least they have some level of upside. Willer showed a little bit, through their Worlds run last year that leads me to believe that he has, like, some level of talent that you can try to unlock, and it's not like On Fleek is going to give you anything. And then Samdy's just not it, so you might as well go with Cheonny, right? Like, whatever. At that point, they're bad, and they're going to continue to be bad. As for KDF, like I said it earlier in the week, they feel pretty locked into that 7 spot for me. They're not as good as the top 6, although I think they could somehow, like, if DRX just continues to implode and they continue to play bad teams, I could see a world in which they can, like, somehow sneak in there, but I just don't think they're a top 6 team. Like, they're not playing like a top 6 team. They do win this series off of the back of, like, Fate being really good and Keen being really good, but Teddy obviously has been really consistent for them, but they just don't have the consistency and the talent, really, that gives me the expectation that they will actually be a 500 team by the end of the year. If they start playing these better teams, like this week they played Hanwha, and they played Fredit BRION, who, like, you could make a real case that those are the 2 worst teams in the league. And so, of course, getting 2 wins here is great, but, like, it's not, like, the most dominant wins that you've seen in your life. So it's certainly something to keep in mind, but I wouldn't hedge my bets on this team being able to make playoffs. That's going to bring us to our final series of the week here. And of course, I am talking about a pretty fun one here between Nongshim, RedForce, and Fredit BRION. Bro actually wins this one 2-0. And that's a little bit surprising, I think, for a lot of people. Especially after Nongshim was actually able to beat Liiv SANDBOX early in the week. But like I said earlier, SANDBOX certainly has a pattern to beat them with. And I think Nongshim just took advantage of that pattern. Fredit BRION is the better team here, and I hate saying that, but honestly, just at this point feels true. I think Fredit BRION is better than Nongshim, and that's really sad to say, but it is what it is here. Shout out to Lava. Lava had a very good series. Obviously, I've talked about it quite a bit on this channel. Big reason why this Fredit BRION team was actually able to make that big push in Spring was because I think Lava played super above expectations, and he really has come back down to earth here in summer, but he still has these games where when he knows he's a good player and he's playing a bad team, he can show up, and he showed up in this one. He's going to get my player of the series here. He was very, very good to watch. He had a good game 1 here on the Victor, but and also a really good game 2 on the Rise. Really, both of those games were influential and pretty impactful in creating a 2-0 bro win here. Not the only member of this team that was impactful, but definitely I think Lava had the most impact on the reason it was such an easy 2-0 win here. Neither game was ever really that close. I want to give a shout out to Umpty. I've been really critical of Umpty as a jungler, and yes, I think he's been relatively bad so far this year. I thought he had a good series here. 2 games of Poppy, 1 into Nocturne, 1 into Wukong, both relatively good here for the Poppy. Nocturne's a good pick if you're going into a super long-range comp, but I really don't like it into Sivir set. I don't really think it does actually that much for you in that circumstance, and especially Poppy, if she just sits on the Sivir, can make it very difficult for you to actually kill her, and that's essentially what happened, right? Set and Poppy had so much peel that Dread's Nocturne was essentially irrelevant. Numpty was able to do a lot of really good work. And then in game 2, he just created so many advantages for the map. He created it with Renekton in the top lane, a great 2v2 matchup there. Created it for Lava on the Rise, for Henna on the Zeri. Honestly, just a really good game from Umpty, generally speaking, in game 2 here. But Morgan, Lord Morgan still performing way above expectation. You can make a real argument that he's been the best player on this Fredit BRION team all year long. He had a really good game 1 here on the Gnar. He leads the game in kills, even if he doesn't have, like, the most impact on the game. And then a really good game here on the Renekton. A really good 2v2 here with him and Umpty, being able to take advantage of Kana and Dread quite frequently, which is not usually how that Renekton GP matchup typically goes. So definitely fun to watch here. Henna and Delight are fine. Not really much to talk about. It's really this top side of the map for Fredit BRION that gives them any sort of upside, and they continue to look relatively good when they win and relatively bad when they lose, maybe with the exception of Morgan. As Nongshim goes, like, blah. Like, you bring Snowflower in here, and he really, honestly, like, I don't mean to be rude. He is just as bad as Effort was. Like, if Effort was the worst player in the LCK, like, Snowflower has just, like, assumed that role ever since coming onto the team. I think you can make a real case that Snowflower has somehow even been worse than Effort was. Like, he has been really, really bad for this team. He's going to get my dud of the series here as he plays a game of Nautilus where he gets obliterated over and over again, and then a game of Amumu where he does nothing. He does absolutely nothing. I think you could realistically give the dud of the series here to Kana as well, who had a very bad top lane time here against Morgan, which if you would have told me that sentence a year ago, I would have lost my mind, but Kana just got outplayed by Morgan in both games, especially in game 2 here, with Kana here on the gangplank, just getting kind of dove over and over again by that Poppy, creating a lot of advantages for the Renekton, and Morgan having a really good game in game 1 generally as well. Honestly, those two members of Kana and Snowflower were easily the two worst members of Nongshim in this series. Dread and BDD continue to do their absolute best to, like, win the game, but Dread just got out-jungled, quite frankly, by Umti, especially in game 2, which is not what you want to see. BDD and Ghost were fine, but they were never going to win this. They were never going to win a game here. They just don't have that in them. So, outlook-wise, Nongshim continues to be bad. Like, not even just, like, not good, but, like, actively bad. They continue to be a part of this bottom 3, but I think you can make a case that they're, 9 or 10. At this point, I feel pretty confident about Fredit BRION being number 8 in that bottom 3. They just show more than Nongshim does consistently, like, over and over again. They have the same game score, even though Nongshim has an extra series win. Fredit BRION, honestly, just shows a lot more fight, even in their losses. So I feel pretty confident about saying Fredit BRION is the better team overall. But, Nongshim versus Hanwha Life, I think you could make the toss-up there. None of these 3 teams are going to be making playoffs. It won't even be close for any of them, but, it's interesting to see them play each other because it gives us a clearer picture as to, like, well, what teams really are super depressing to watch, and unfortunately, I think for Nongshim fans, that's them this year, 100%. All right, that is going to do it for my Week 7 overview and analysis of all 5 days of LCK action. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings from 1 to 10. Any teams that have a green number highlighted next to them have officially locked in a playoff spot. Any teams with a red number highlighted next to them have officially been eliminated, not only from playoffs, but from Worlds, from Worlds contention in all of their cases, unfortunately. So, in the first column, I will say, will be my updated power rankings for all 10 teams. In the second column, you'll see the change column. That is how that has changed from last week to this week. We can go over the risers and the fallers. Now, the biggest riser this week is going to be KT Rolster, jumping up from number 6 in my power rankings, actually jumping into that top 4 here, going to number 4. I feel more confident about them than I do DRX right now, and I feel more confident about them than I do Liiv SANDBOX right now. So KT jumps up to number 4, although, like I have been saying for weeks and weeks and weeks on end, really, the difference between KT, DRX, SANDBOX is all very minuscule. We are going to get a really, really interesting answer to that question in playoffs as to which one of those 3 teams is really the best, but right now in regular season, it's very difficult. They've all taken games off of each other, so it's very difficult to kind of get a read on that, but for me right now, I just feel most confident about KT at number 4. The other risers this week, Gen.G jumping up to number 1. They've earned it now at this point. Not only have they played better for a majority of the year, but they did actually beat T1. So for me, they're jumping up to number 1. I'm not saying that they're going to be there all year long. I still think it's going to be a very interesting finals between those two if they do make it, but for now, Gen.G jumps up to number 1. And then both Nongshim and Fredit BRION leapfrog Hanwha Life, who was at number 8 last week. They fall down to number 10, as they really do feel like the worst team in the LCK. And everybody else jumps up 1 because of it. Nongshim gets out of that 10 spot to number 9, and Fredit BRION goes up to number 8. Other fallers this week, T1 dropping down to number 2. Like I said, Gen.G kind of leapfrogging them. And then both Liiv SANDBOX and DRX dropping down to make room for KT to jump into number 4. Like I said, the difference between those 3 is very, very minuscule. So the placement there is more of just a consistency thing for me. But that leads us into our player of the week and our dud of the week here for week 7. And our week 7 player of the week in the LCK is going to go to Chovy on Gen.G. It's his first player of the week of summer, which surprised me a lot, but he was just phenomenal this week, not only like in their first series, but in their second series as well. Like, he was just really, really consistently great all week long. And he's been great all year long. Obviously, he's shown that he doesn't need a ton of resources to be impactful on the map. And I think that is definitely a show of improvement from Chovy as someone who I think always used to feel like they were a resource-heavy player. He definitely doesn't feel like that as much anymore. And he proved that this week, you know, getting resources and then not getting resources and dominating in both. So very, very fun to watch for Gen.G there and for Chovy in particular. But my dud of the week, honestly, was really easy for me to pick this week. My dud of the week in week 7 is going to go to BRION on DRX, who was just really, really awful this week. There was really no other way to put it. I know a lot of people are talking about how DAMWON's, you know, fall from grace has been due to missing out on Ghost and Barrel, but man, neither of them are performing all that well on their new teams either, so it's definitely maybe more of a synergy thing. I don't know what to tell you. Barrel has not been good for DRX this year, and he was especially not good this week in their 0-2 week. So for me, it was pretty easy to make that decision. My dud of the week in week 7 is Barrel on DRX, and my player of the week in week 7 is Chovy on Gen.G. But that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed this video, please go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot for the channel. Let me know down in the comment section below your game of the week, your series of the week, all that fun stuff. Also, your player of the week, your dud of the week, what team you think is too high in the power rankings, what team you think is too low in the power rankings. I love discussing all that stuff with you. You know I love having that conversation. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.